Please join me in welcoming Ian Balfour.
Perhaps I can speak over that little noise. So I'll be introducing Simon, and then we'll hear his talk. I'll give a brief-ish response and then moderate things. Whether I can moderate myself remains to be seen. Certainly Simon will need moderating, and probably you. First I'll read Simon Critchley's own account of himself, and then I'll gloss it a little. Simon Critchley was born in Hertfordshire, England in 1960 and currently lives and works in New York as professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research, where he works in continental philosophy, history of philosophy, literature, ethics, and politics. He failed dramatically, these are his own words, he failed dramatically at school before failing in a large number of punk bands in the late 1970s and failing as a poet some time later. This was followed by failure as a radical political activist. By complete accident, he ended up at university where he was when he was 22, decided to stay. He found a vocation in teaching philosophy, although his passions still lie in music, poetry, and politics. His books include The Ethics of Deconstruction, 1992, Very Little, Almost Nothing, 1997, On Humor, 2002, Things Merely Are, 2005, Infinitely Demanding, 2007, and The Book of Dead Philosophers, 2008. So far, Simon Critchley on himself. By most accounts, he has succeeded in this last vocation and in spades. He's one of the most prolific and wide-ranging philosophers of our time. Interestingly, though steeped more in continental than in analytic philosophy, he's one of relatively few thinkers who takes seriously and reads on both sides of the fence. Among his signal achievements from the many books he's authored, I'd single out the book on humor, a humorous book on humor, which is saying a lot, since there's almost nothing deadlier than having to explain a joke. And the humor actually doesn't even let up in his most recent book on the dead philosophers, the Book of Dead Philosophers, which is really almost a laugh a minute or a laugh a page, despite the subject matter. And even while he's doing all of this of his own work, so to speak, he's also been extremely important in enabling the work of others. He's the general editor of the very impressive Granta series that introduced any number of thinkers and authors how to read X, which, as opposed to most of those series introducing X, Y, and Z, which tend to reduce the thought of a difficult thinker to a number of slogans, a number of intellectual sound bites, the series that Critchley edits takes the texts of each of these writers and thinkers seriously and works with them. So it seems to me among the best of those sorts of things, and Critchley has been very important in enabling that. Now I'll turn things over to Simon Critchley for his talk, Mystical Anarchism.
Thanks very much. Is this one on? Am I audible? Okay. I'm going to sort of wander about a little bit. Thanks to Greg and to Claire and to Ian, and thank you to John Davis for lots of help getting this organised, and special thanks to Helena Reckitt, who we go back a long way to the time when the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London had a philosophy program, and it wasn't just an outlet for Toshiba sponsorship and such things like that. Anyway, the theme of the show is community, the symposium. I want to talk about mystical anarchism. I've been thinking about this question for the last year, and I started to write this talk about 3 weeks ago, and it got a little bit out of control. I've got 42 pages, and I only reread them yesterday because I hadn't finished it until Monday, and I can't really reread until I know I've finished. So I apologise to Ian in advance for making him read it, making his job harder. And also I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this, but so I've got a summary which I'm going to try and keep to. Let me begin by drawing a triangle and saying, how do we understand the political reality through which we're moving at present? I think the political reality we're moving through is dominated by the factor of religious war. We seem to have passed from a secular age, which we were told was post-metaphysical, to a new situation where political action seems to flow directly from religious belief, metaphysical conflict. So there's a fatal entanglement of politics and religion. Those are the two. It's the base of the triangle I want to construct. So politics and how do we understand the present? Politics and religion, and the fatal intrications of politics and religion. The third vertex of the triangle is violence. So in terms of three concepts that can help us to get a grip on the present, it's politics, religion, and violence, and in particular the phenomenon of sacred political violence, which is all too obvious. It barely needs to be explained. The question of community has to be framed, I think, in terms of this triangulation of politics, religion, and violence. I want to look at, so that's my overall framework. I want to look at one way of thinking about that triangle, one phenomenon, and that's what I want to call mystical anarchism, of which more presently. It's a very strange thing. But one place to begin would be to say that it's an obvious place to begin, but it's one that people refer to. Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt, in his lectures on the concept of sovereignty, says all significant concepts in the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. So Schmitt has this idea that all the concepts in modern politics, broadly, are secularized theological concepts. And we could give abundant evidence of that. Just one stop along the route would be to look at, say, for example, the idea of the general will. The general will in the 17th century referred to the will of God. In the 18th century, it refers to the will of the people. There's a transposition of the divine to the civic that takes place. Now, to begin from that idea, Schmitt makes a very interesting remark in a couple of places. Now, maybe I'll begin with that. It's the following. It's to say that every conception of the political has to take a position on human nature. A position on human nature. The object of Schmitt's attack of his animus is liberalism. What Schmitt loathes is liberal constitutionalism, of the kind, say, defended by Obama. Obama is a classical liberal constitutionalist. Norms have to be derived, decisions have to be derived from norms, from legality. That's Obamaism. Schmitt defends an idea of the decision which overrides the norm, and that's what he calls the political. Okay, the two conceptions of politics which oppose liberalism both derive from conceptions of human nature. One is authoritarianism, the other is anarchism. If you believe that human nature is fundamentally wicked, you'll be an authoritarian in politics. That's Schmitt's intuition. If you believe that human nature is essentially good, you'll be an anarchist. And Schmitt sees both positions as respectable positions, but obviously he favours authoritarianism. So an authoritarian belief in an authoritarian conception of community, if you like, an authoritarian conception of politics, derives from a conception of the essential wickedness of human nature. This is why, for Schmitt, the concept of original sin is the key concept for thinking about politics. The concept of original sin. And this is going to be essential in what I'm going to try and develop. For heroes of Schmitt, like Donoso Cortés and Joseph de Maistre, reactionary counter-revolutionaries of the early 19th century, human beings are naturally depraved, and essentially there is something defective in human nature. If there's something defective in human nature, we require the corrective of the church and the corrective of the state in order to maintain order. Right? So the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of the church flow from a belief in original sin. Human beings require the hard rule of authority because they are defective. If we could achieve a sinless union with others, then the state and church would disappear. Now, anarchists, on the other hand, according to Schmitt, he traces this view to Rousseau, but it's all over the place. Anarchists believe that human wickedness is a social and historical outcome. A social and historical outcome that overlays a nature which is essentially good. And if that nature is allowed free expression without the hindrance of the state, then human beings will be able to cooperate mutually and cooperatively. Right? So the two conceptions of politics that contrast with liberalism, authoritarianism, and anarchism flow from conceptions of human nature. Let me just stay with the idea of original sin. Because you might think original sin is some outdated relic from some, religious past. The idea of there being something essentially defective in human nature is something which has been repeatedly, if you like, modernized. For example, I want to present sort of three ways in which we rethink the idea of original sin. Freud, right? Freud adopts a version of Schopenhauer's thesis that there is an essential disjunction between eros and civilization, between, as it were, the natural life of the drives and human civilization. And that disjunction, Freud says in his more pessimistic moment, doesn't show any signs of being able to be reconciled. There's just a disjunction between, as it were, original sin in the guise of the drives and the work of civilization. Heidegger's early work, arguably, I would argue, is a rethinking of Luther's conception of original sin. The ideas you get in Heidegger of thrownness, of facticity, and inauthenticity are ways of thinking an essential lack, an essential defectiveness in human nature. Obviously, Lacan blends the two. But there's a third version of the idea of original sin, to show that original sin is still very much with us. This would be a naturalized Darwinian idea of original sin. And the philosopher who represents this view most powerfully, in my view, is John Gray, political philosopher at the LSE, or he was. He gave the job up. Not the guy that wrote the book on Venus and Mars. That's another John Gray, I think, anyway. Maybe he's moonlighting. But Gray, to put it brutally, Gray's thesis is that human beings are killer apes. Right? They're killer apes. The human being is Homo rapiens, rapacious hominids. Right? But it's not just that we're killer apes with metaphysical longing. Right? So we are killer apes who learn nothing from history, yet we long for some meaning to existence. And that's our tragedy for Gray. These two things pull apart in different ways. So Gray defends a Darwinian naturalized idea of original sin. Right? That's another way of thinking this. And this is an incredibly persuasive idea because it gives us reason to explain our misery and our sense of disappointment and dejection at the sphere of human action. Human beings fuck up because they're killer apes. Right? And they don't just fuck up, they fuck up and still long for meaning, for a narrative arc to their existence, as Obama would say. They still long for something else because they have a metaphysical longing as well. And once we give up the liberal humanistic ideas of progress and the perfectibility of humankind, and we reconcile ourselves to the fact that the human species is, human existence goes in cycles of sort of destructiveness. And eventually, this is where Gray's brilliant, he links this to the Gaia hypothesis, which suggests that, you know, the most ludicrous extension of liberal humanism is the idea that we can save the planet, right? We can't save the planet. We're the problem. We're killer apes. But that's neither here nor there. The planet will save itself when human numbers have been sufficiently dramatically reduced, back down to about 500 million. Gray suggests. So this is a sort of a reassuringly bleak Darwinian naturalization of the idea of original sin. There's an essential defectiveness to what it means to be human. And that's in continuity with this older tradition that you find in people like Schmitt that goes back to Catholic political theology and the rest. Okay. Gray suggests that we should reject the utopian impulse in political thinking. The utopian impulse, for a utopian community, has always led to different forms of disaster, different forms of disaster. The idea that one should impose virtue by means of terror, right? And the example is always Jacobinism, 1792 in France. Against that, Gray suggests that because we're killer apes with metaphysical longing, we should embrace what he calls political realism. Political realism is really a form of old-fashioned Burkean Tory thinking that, you know, if we get the sort of neoconservative thinking, I mean, conservatism traditionally as a political philosophy had a deeply pessimistic conception of human nature. So Gray wants to go back to that. Okay. The utopian impulse in thinking is a source of human misery for people like Schmitt and Gray. So the question I want to address is whether that's the case. And what I want to look at now, and I can't do this in the detail I'd like to do it in, is to look at the version of politics that they explicitly reject, namely anarchism. Now, I've defended anarchism in a certain version in some recent work I've done, but that's all very, very well. I want to defend the weirdest, most extreme form of anarchism imaginable, what I want to call mystical anarchism. And the issue here is going to take us back to the 11th century, briefly. And hopefully the fruits of this will emerge as we move through it. And I want to focus on a specific heresy that emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries and lasted through to the 16th century. And this is described with extraordinary brilliance by the historian Norman Cohn in his book The Pursuit of the Millennium, which is the book that Gray leans on. Now, what Cohn is trying to diagnose and what Gray is worried about is revolutionary millenarianism. What is revolutionary millenarianism? It's the idea that you find expressed in certain of the Jewish prophets and then in the early Christian church, and then it re-emerges with extraordinary violence in the Middle Ages. The idea that we're living in the last times, that the end is at hand. And what will happen is that a Christ figure will appear, a messianic figure will appear, and that Christ figure will rally to him a band of true saints, and they will identify an antichrist figure as an enemy, destroy the antichrist, and then Christ will rule with the company of the saints for 1,000 years, hence the millennium, after which time there'll be the last judgment. Okay? That's the structure of millennial thinking. And it's fascinating stuff. Revolutionary millenarianism desires a boundless social transformation that attempts to recover an egalitarian state of nature, a kind of golden age of primitive communism. So what's behind forms of millenarian politics is the idea that we can throw off the shackles of church and state. So the Antichrist always shifts in this thinking. The Antichrist can be, say, the Muslims in the case of the Crusades, the Jews. Pogroms against the Jews appear in this period. But usually it's the Catholic Church. Usually it's the Pope or the King. That you can throw off the shackles of church and state and recover the Garden of Eden, recover paradise. And in paradise, there would be no private property. There would be a commonality of ownership. There's a famous proverb from the English Peasants' Revolt from the late 14th century, which is possibly recited by the famous hedge priest John Ball. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? Right? There was no hierarchy, inequality, and property in the Garden of Eden. You see where this is going. So inequality, private property, individualism, if you like, have their source in the fall, have their source in the fact of original sin. The mystical anarchist heresy is the idea that we can recover a state of primary perfection, recover an Edenic, communistic state. We can build the new Jerusalem. Now, what's fascinating about this form of millenarian revolutionary thinking is that it appears amongst the poor in newly urbanized centers in Northern Europe. It appears in Italy as well, but the cone focuses on Northern Europe, Flanders, down the Rhine Valley. These, if you like, the Industrial Revolution begins back then with the advent of the textile industry. And what you have are urbanized rural populations that go to the city and experience a sort of a dislocation in a new mode of production. And it appears that millenarian thinking arises in this context. Right? Amongst not just the poor, but amongst the socially dislocated poor. It's exactly the same argument that Marx will make however many centuries later about the emergence of the proletariat. The category that describes the emergence of the proletariat is dislocation. It's not just that the poor have always been poor. What we have with the emergence of the proletariat is a newly dislocated poor. And these are the people who are ripe for forms of millenarian heresy. You can extend this. You can actually, if you wanted to, and it's a fascinating topic, look at the connection between forms of social dislocation, poverty, and radical religious belief. Another field study here would be thinking about the emergence of radical forms of utopianism and communism in the 19th century, say New York State. In the most beautiful version would be the Shakers. Anyway, so where's this? Oh, I should mention the flagellants here. This is also good. Cohn writes The greatest wave of millenarian excitement, one that swept through the whole of society, was precipitated by the most universal natural disaster of the Middle Ages, the Black Death. Right? There's a correlation between disease, social upheaval, and new forms of utopian communistic thinking. The flagellant movement, for example, appeared in Perugia in 1260 as an apparent consequence of the famine of 1250 and the plague of 1259. It swept from Italy into the Rhine Valley. Flagellation was like the latest thing amongst the poor. It swept like wildfire across Europe. Great crowds of itinerant flagellants went from town to town like a scourging insurgency, becoming godlike through acts of collective imitatio Christi. Now, such extreme self-punishment was deemed heretical because it threatened the church's authority over the economy of punishment, penitence, and consolation. The poor were not meant to take the whip into their own hands. Right? That was the issue. Who holds the whip? So that's one example. But the centerpiece of Cone's analysis, and what I want to turn to now, and it's going to get pretty weird, is the heresy of the free spirit. The heresy of the free spirit, which we know relatively little about, but it's the central heresy of the Middle Ages. Everything turns here on the interpretation of St. Paul's words. Paul writes in Corinthians 2, "Now the Lord is in the Spirit, and where the Lord's Spirit is, there is freedom." Where the Lord's Spirit is, there is freedom. Now there are two possibilities of interpretation here. Either the Lord's Spirit is outside the self or it's inside the self. If the Lord's Spirit is outside the self, because the soul languishes in sin, then freedom can only come through submitting oneself to the divine will and awaiting the saving activity of grace. Right? That's orthodox Christian teaching, standard Christian teaching, which explains the necessity for the authority of the church. The church is, if you like, the portal to the divine that we require, given our sinful state. But if, and this is the key to the heresy, if the Lord's Spirit is within the self, then the soul is free and has no need of the mediation of the church. Indeed, and we'll come back to this, if the Lord's Spirit is within the self, then essentially there's no difference between the soul and God. You become God at that point. The heretical Adamites who moved to Bohemia after being expelled from Picardy in the early 15th century are reported as beginning the Lord's Prayer with the words, "Our Father who art within us." Right? Our Father who art within us. If a community participates in the Spirit of God, then it is free and has no need of the agency of the church or the state or law or the police. These are institutions which an unfree community has imposed upon it. So you can see the anarchistic consequences of this heresy, I hope. Now, there was an abundant literature of the free spirit in the Middle Ages, which was almost completely destroyed by the Inquisition. There are some apocryphal texts, but the one text, which it was only discovered in 1946 as belonging to this woman, is a text by Marguerite Porete, and it's called "The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, and Who Remain Only in Wanting and Desire of Love." It's a great title, right? "The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, and Who Remain Only in Wanting and the Desire of Love." So this woman, Marguerite Porete, who I'd urge you to read if you have the inclination, writes this extraordinary text. She writes other texts, a text on the refinement of love, which was burnt with her when she was burnt. And it seems to have, this text seems to have existed in multiple manuscripts in different languages all across the Middle Ages. Marguerite Porete, and this was typical of mystics of this period, lived as an unenclosed, what's called a beguine, an unenclosed beguine. And these were itinerant, mendicant women who moved from town to town and went from community to community. And the church initially tolerated them, and increasingly persecuted them because they were trouble. The Beguines often moved together with their brothers, the Beggars, from which we get the English word beggar. And Marguerite seems to have had an itinerant mendicant life. The key thing here was, if you read, say, the books like The Name of the Rose or whatever, did Christ own his cloak, right? This was a huge issue in medieval theological discussion. The Franciscans, and then later these heretics, believed in the absolute poverty of Christ, right? And the absolute poverty of Christ had to be imitated through a life of absolute poverty and mendicancy. So one's life was a refusal of work, and an itinerant life, moving from town to town, preaching and trying to convert people. Anyway, Marguerite was treated with relative liberality because she was presumed, we think, from the upper classes. There's a huge issue here, fascinating issue, which has caught the attention of a number of scholars, and a poet like Anne Carson, for example, who writes an opera about Marguerite Porete. The way that women are involved in the heresy of the free spirit. So what we have, if you like, sociologically, is we have the emergence of a leisured female class, the daughters, the unmarried daughters of the bourgeoisie in these Flemish towns, and these women become radicalized theologically and start to move in insurgent political circles. Anyway, Marguerite was prosecuted on 2 occasions and eventually burnt at the stake in 1310. And her books were burnt with her, it was thought. And she's seen by mystical scholars of mysticism like Amy Hollywood and poets like Anne Carson, as a vital precursor to modern feminism. Actually, during her trial, Poret's work is referred to as being not just full of errors and heresies, but she's referred to as a pseudo-Molière, a fake woman. Right? It's part of the condemnation of her. Anyway, I digress. Well, I don't digress. This is the core of mystical anarchism. Marguerite Porete. It's fantastic stuff. In chapter 118 of The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, she outlines the 7 stages which need to be followed in order for the devout soul to become divine. Something we could all follow relatively easily. This evening, later on, after a few drinks, we could... And I won't go into it now, because it would take us too long and it might be embarrassing. But let me just say that there are 7 stages. Roughly, you begin by accepting God's law. You overcome, first step, you overcome God's law through the act of love, second stage. Then you, in the 3rd stage, this is where it gets really interesting. You have to, and then we get the use of this extraordinary masochistic language in the female mystics of this period. We have to hack and hew away at ourselves to open up a hole large enough for love to enter, Marguerite says. Hack and hew away at ourselves, annihilate ourselves so that we open up a space that's large enough for love to enter. And that the 4th stage is when we feel that love enters. It's all about the refinement of love. And that makes us feel drunk. And I've got a great analysis of the drunkenness of mystical experience using William James and nitrous oxide and whatever. William James said the only way he could understand Hegel was on laughing gas, on nitrous oxide. But I digress. The 5th stage is when we recover from that drunkenness, we have a hangover, and we go back to a mood of dereliction, despair, and distance from God. If you know anything about the mystical tradition, you realize this is the common feature of mystics. It's both the ecstatic union with the divine and the feeling of dereliction and distance from the divine. That's the 5th step. And that's very painful. The 6th step is the key one. And this is what got her into so much trouble. The task here, and you'll see where this is going in a minute, believe me. The task here is the annihilation of the soul. That's what Marguerite Porete sets out to do, to annihilate the soul. And that's a technique that can be learned if you hew and hack away at yourself such that you make yourself nothing. And she says, the soul annihilated, she says, sees neither God nor herself, but, listen to this is wild, but God sees himself of himself in her, for her, without there, who, that is God, shows to her that there is nothing except him. And therefore this soul knows nothing except him, loves nothing except him, and praises nothing except him. For there is nothing but he. So the soul annihilated becomes the place for God's infinite self-reflection. Right? Totally amazing. That's the sixth state. If the soul has become nothing, it has the possibility to become divine. That's the heresy. That's the heresy of the free spirit. At that moment, the Lord Spirit is within you. And that's not good. Or if you don't. I've lost 15 pages of my text here. Okay, right, there we are. So, Anne Carson writes in her inquiry, to sort of translate this out a little bit, the seventh stage is everlasting life, which happens after death. So we'll put that to one side for the moment. Anne Carson rightly asks in her inquiry into how it is that women like Sappho, Simone Weil, and Marguerite Porete tell God. She says, what is it that love dares the self to do? And Anne Carson answers that love dares the self to leave itself behind to enter into poverty. So love, on this account, this is why I'm sort of translating it to a certain extent, is the audacity of impoverishment, the audacity of complete submission. It's an act of absolute spiritual daring that induces a passivity where the self becomes annihilated. It's a subjective act where the subject extinguishes itself. Become a husk or an empty vessel through this act of daring, the fullness of love enters in. It's through the act of annihilation that the soul knows nothing but God and loves nothing except him, as Marguerite Porete says. So those are the 7 stages of self-deification. Right? So what? I mean, why was this condemned as heresy? Well, easy, right? Once the soul is annihilated, then there's nothing to stop me unifying with God. There's no me anymore. My annihilated soul becomes the space of God's self-reflection. So when I become nothing, I become God. Right? When I become nothing, I become God. Now, what are the consequences of this belief, this heresy? When I become nothing, I become God. When I become divine in this sense, I achieve a state prior to the fact of original sin. Right? I've annihilated original sin within myself, according to Porete. And if human beings are perfected in this way, then this has dramatic political consequences. The first consequence, and one finds this throughout the writings of the heresy of the free spirit and other radical texts of the period, is that private property disappears. The distinction between mine and thine vanishes. In the annihilation of the soul, mine becomes thine, I become thou, and the no place of the soul becomes the space of divine self-reflection. But an experience of divinity is not my individual private property. It is, these writers insist, the commonwealth of those who are free in spirit. So what the heresy achieves is the commonwealth of those who are free in spirit. Private property, then, is just the consequence of our fallen state. Private property is a consequence of original sin. So the political form of the movement of the free spirit is communism. Right? And that's why it was so dangerous. And furthermore, it's a communism whose social bond is love, right? And not law. I've got a whole analysis of the relationship between love and law here that I won't go into. Again, if we had world enough and time, I could show the way in which certain of these tropes reappear, say, in 19th century radical traditions. I mean, Marx imagined a communist society would be a society without law. Right? And this is the most dramatic concept. So, no separation between myself and God, no separation between mine and thine. Property is held in common. The fact of God is the union of the commonwealth, of the community. The community that's free in spirit is the realization of the divine. That's mystical anarchism, right? In its essence. And what was so dangerous about this belief, about this heresy, was that if human beings are free of original sin, then there is no longer any legitimacy to moral constraint, any legitimacy to moral prohibition. The only moral prohibitions have to flow directly from the fact of our freedom. And this then leads to the various accusations of immoralism and licentiousness against the heretics of the free spirit. And I don't tend to believe this, but if you look at the literature on this, you'll read people who will say that, I mean, basically what the heretics of the free spirit permitted was sort of generalized sort of fucking or something like that, and or licentiousness, and people will trace the origins of 18th century libertinage that find expression, say, in the Marquis de Sade, back to the movement of the free spirit. I'm less persuaded by that. I mean, what one finds in this mystical anarchism, this heretical movement, is a different idea of the disciplining of the self. It's a disciplining of the self that flows from the fact of freedom, which is something that's only held in common. So, to my mind, the heresy of the free spirit could find expression, I think, more coherently in communities that were chaste, that practiced chastity. Right? I'm very interested in the theme of chastity, for reasons that I can't go into at the moment. I mean, for example, think of the Shakers. The Shakers were obviously heretics, communist heretics, and their social bond was love, which was realized through chastity. Anyway, where's this all going to next? Well, what do we make of this heresy? Norman Cohn thinks that this heresy is this heresy is a constantly recurring and dangerous threat in Western civilization. He's writing in the 50s and 60s, and he's looking at forms of, if you like, experimental communism in the 1960s and finding their ancestry back in the heresy of the free spirit. And his suggestion is that they're dangerous. And John Gray obviously endorses that view. Another view, which you might know about or not, is that of Raoul van Eigem. Raoul van Eigem, who was the second most famous situationist behind Debord. In fact, I got a call got to Toronto Airport, and someone from NPR who just says, "I'm from NPR. How do you pronounce the name D-E-B-O-R-D? Debord." I said, "Debord." "Oh, right, Debord. Okay, good. And how do you pronounce his first name?" "Guy." "Okay, Guy. Well, thank you very much," and just hung up. No idea. It's true. It's true. I just got out of immigration at the airport. Van Eigem was the second most famous situationist. In 1986, it's late Van Eigem, he writes a book called The Movement of the Free Spirit. And what you see in that book is an attempt to trace situationist ideas of community and freedom back to this medieval heresy. And he thinks it's great, but it's all about, as it were, in a sense for him, libertinage, passionate attraction, and the rest. I won't go into this now, but the figure that, talking about obscure anarchists, Gustav Landauer is a fascinating figure, great influence on Benjamin, Scholem, Buber, and all the rest. And I was reading an essay by Landau recently called Anarchic Thoughts on Anarchism, where he, and the context is very interesting. The context is the assassination of William McKinley, President of the United States in 1901, by someone who professed to be an anarchist because he'd heard a speech by Emma Goldman and was sort of enthused by it, so go and kill the president. Landau says, what connection does anarchism have to acts of assassination? There's absolutely none at all. And then goes into a non-violent argument for anarchism. And then says towards the end that actually anarchism is dependent upon killing oneself. Right? Killing oneself. He says, it's not enough for us to reject conditions and institutions, we have to reject ourselves. Do not kill others, only yourself. Such will be the maxim of those who accept the challenge to create their own chaos in order to discover their most authentic and precious inner being, and goes on like this. So we find as another way of thinking this idea of self-annihilation as a condition for a transformed sociality. Okay. That's that, and we're on page 36. I just want to read my conclusion now, which won't take long. This is where it does come actually to the issues of the exhibition, very interesting exhibition. We're living through a long anti-1960s. The various experiments in communal living and collective existence that define that period seem to us either quaintly passé, laughably unrealistic, or dangerously misguided. We now know better than to try and bring heaven crashing down to earth and construct concrete utopias. To that extent, despite our occasional and transient enthusiasms, Obamaism or whatever, we're all political realists. Indeed, most of us are passive nihilists and cynics. This is why we still require a belief in something like original sin. Without the conviction that the human condition is essentially flawed and dangerously rapacious, we would have no way of justifying our disappointment. And what human beings want to do more than anything else is to find reasons to justify their misery. Right? That's why people read Agamben. Pitchy remark. If it's indeed true that those utopian political movements of the 1960s, like the Situationist International, where an echo of the movement of the free spirit could be heard, led to various forms of disillusionment, disintegration, and in extreme cases, disaster. Experiments in the collective ownership of property or in communal living based on sexual freedom without the repressive institution of the family, or indeed R.D. Laing, I love R.D. Laing's experimental communal asylums with no distinction between the so-called mad and the so-called sane. These all seem like distant, whimsical cultural memories captured in dog-eared yellow paperbacks and grainy, poor quality film. It's a world that we struggle to understand. Perhaps such communal experiments were too pure and overfull of righteous conviction. Perhaps they were, in a word, too moralistic to ever endure. Perhaps such experiments were doomed because of what we might call a politics of abstraction, in the sense of being overly attached to an idea at the expense of a frontal denial of reality. What do I mean by abstraction? At their most extreme, say in the activities of the Weather Underground, or the Red Army faction, or the Red Brigades of the 1970s, the moral certitude of the closed and pure community becomes fatally linked to a redemptive, cleansing violence. Terror becomes the means to bring about the end of virtue, in the guise of proletarian justice, say with the Red Brigades. The death of individuals is just a speck on the vast heroic canvas of the class struggle. This culminated in a politics of violence, where acts of abduction, kidnapping and hijacking and assassination were justified through an attachment to a set of ideas. As a character in Jean-Luc Godard's Notre Musique remarks, to kill a human being in order to defend an idea is not to defend an idea, it's to kill a human being. Tuer un homme pour défendre une idée n'est pas de défendre une idée, c'est tuer un homme. Perhaps such groups were too attached to the idea of immediacy, the propaganda of the violent deed as the impatient attempt to storm the heavens. Perhaps such experiments lacked an understanding of politics as a constant and concrete process of mediation between subjective ethical commitment based on a general principle, for example, the equality of all, and the experience of local organisation that builds fronts and alliances between disparate groups and often conflicting sets of interests. So maybe these extraordinary communal experiments of the 1960s suffered from a moralism, a purism, a desire for immediacy. Perhaps such utopian experiments in community only live on in the institutionally sanctioned spaces of the contemporary art world. One thinks of projects like l'Association des Temps Libérés from 1995 or Utopia Station from 2003, and many other examples, somewhat fossilized in a recent show at the Guggenheim in New York, the Any Space Whatever. In the work of artists like Philippe Perregnon and Liam Gillick, or curators like Hans-Ulrich Obrist, there's a deeply felt situationist nostalgia for ideas of collectivity, action, self-management, collaboration, and indeed the idea of the group as such. The idea of the group. In such art practice, which Nicolas Bourriaud has successfully branded as relational, art is the acting out of a situation in order to see if, in Obrist's words, something like a collective intelligence might exist. Right? And the form of experimentation, for example, that Hans Ulrich uses are these marathons. Right? We put people in a room for 24 hours or in a tent for 24 hours and we'll talk endlessly. And we'll try and, as it were, imagine a collective intelligence, a community. Maybe it would be better if we worked in groups of three, as Gillick notes. Of course, the problem with such experiments is twofold, and it's an obvious critique. On the one hand, they're only enabled and legitimated through the cultural institutions of the art world, and thus utterly enmeshed in the circuits of commodification and spectacle that they seek to subvert, if they seek to subvert it. And on the other hand, the dominant mode for approaching an experience of the communal is usually through the strategy of reenactment. One doesn't engage in a bank heist. One reenacts Patty Hearst's adventures with the Symbionese Liberation Army in a warehouse in Brooklyn or whatever. Or one doesn't engage in student protest and get shot in Kent State. One engages in a beautifully constructed artistic reenactment of that we have in the exhibition. It's a thought here about the institution and about the concern with reenactment as a mode of thinking about community. Situationist détournement is replayed as obsessively planned reenactment. Fascinating as I find such experiments and the work of the artists involved, one suspects what we might call a mannerist situationism. Right? Mannerist in the sense in which Caravaggio stands to Raphael. We have the same gestures, but more graphically, as it were, described, more dramatically described, and therefore, and also less possible to bring into being. The old problem of recuperation that obsessed the situationists does not even apply, because such art is completely co-opted by the socioeconomic system that provides its lifeblood. Perhaps we're witnessing something related to this. I'm trying to think about forms. So one way of thinking community is to say, well, the art institution becomes, as it were, the place for thinking that. Exhibitions such as the one that Nina has curated. Perhaps we're witnessing something related to this in recent events in France. I'll take one example. I don't know if you know about this example. Surrounding the arrest and detention of the so-called Tarnac 9 on the 11th of November 2008. As part of Sarkozy's reactionary politics of fear, itself based on both an overwhelming fear of disorder and an explicit desire to finally annihilate the memory of 1968 in France, which means the idea of community. A number of activists who have been formally associated with the group Tikkun were arrested in rural central France by a force of 150 anti-terrorist police, helicopters, and attendant media. They were living communally in the small village of Tarnac in the Corrèze district of the Massif Central. Apparently, a number of the group's members had bought a small farmhouse and ran a cooperative grocery store and were engaged in such dangerous activities as running a local film club, planting carrots, and delivering food to the elderly. With surprising juridical imagination, they were charged by the French state with pre-terrorism. Right? Pré-terrorisme, right? Pre-terrorism. An accusation linked to acts of sabotage on France's TGV rail system. The basis for this is thought crime, right? This is thought crime. The basis for this thought crime was a passage from a text that they published in 2007 called L'Insurrection qui vient, which is an allusion to, amongst other things, Agamben's La Communauté qui vient, coming community. This is the coming insurrection. Be coming out in semiotext in a couple of months. A wonderfully dystopian diagnosis of contemporary society and a compelling strategy to resist it. The final pages of L'Insurrection advocate acts of sabotage against the transport networks of the social machine, as they call it, and ask the question, this is a quotation from the book, how could a TGV line or an electrical network be rendered useless? Right? So that's the justification for the charge of pre-terrorism. Two of the alleged pre-terrorists, Julien Coupat and Hildoun Lévy, are still in jail, as far as I know, and others have been charged with a terrorist undertaking that carries a prison sentence of 20 years. Such is the repressive and reactionary force of the state, just in case anyone had forgotten. As the authors of L'Insurrection remind us, this is a great quote, governing has never been anything than pushing back by 1,000 subterfuges the moment when the crowd will hang you. Right? L'Insurrection qui vient has powerful echoes of the Situationist International. It's very influenced by Debord and some of the other communist heresies that I've been thinking about. Authorship of L'Insurrection is attributed to La Comité Invisible, the Invisible Committee. And the insurrectional strategy of the group turns around the question of invisibility. I want to think about this a little bit. It's a question of learning how to become imperceptible, they say, of regaining the taste for anonymity, and not exposing and losing oneself in the order of visibility, which is always controlled by the police and the state. The authors of L'Insurrection argue for the proliferation of zones of opacity. So what does the community mean in this sense? It means the creation not of a temporary autonomous zone, but of a zone of opacity, of invisibility. Anonymous spaces where communes might be formed. The book ends with the slogan, again, it's, one almost giggles as you read it, all power to the commune, tout le pouvoir aux communes. In a nod to Blanchot, these communes are described as désœuvrées, inoperative, as refusing the capitalist tyranny of work. Another big situationist theme, right? The domination of work, the refusal of the category of work. That goes right the way back to the doctrines of the poverty of Christ in the 13th century. Why engage in a life of purposeless work? In another text, which is simply called Call, from a couple of years ago, they seek to establish what they call a series of foci of desertion, of secession poles, of rallying points for the runaways, for those who leave, a set of places to take shelter from the control of a civilization that is headed for the abyss. A strategy of sabotage, blockade, and what is called the human strike is proposed in order to weaken still further our doomed civilization. Now, this text, L'Insurrection, is a compelling, exhilarating, and deeply lyrical text that sets off all sorts of historical echoes with movements like the Free Spirit and the Situationists and the rest. The emphasis upon secrecy, upon invisibility, and itinerancy as essential criteria for thinking community. Secrecy, invisibility, itinerancy. And the cultivation of poverty, radical mendicancy, and the refusal of work. But the double programs, the program here is a program on the one hand of sabotage. We need to sabotage the social machine, as they put it, and secession from it, to leave it behind. I think this would be my critique of it, that it risks, again, falling into a certain politics of abstraction. I could say more about that. What's interesting about it, I think, would be to think about issues of maybe in relationship to art. in terms of the cultivation of zones of opacity, invisibility, secrecy, and anonymity, right? So, you know, one way of thinking about the increasing immateriality of artistic production here, I mean, the most extreme version may be something like Tino Segal, right? Where all you get is the instructions to how to carry out the performance. You can actually see anything and nothing is documented. But what follows from this? And I'm coming to my conclusion. Are we to conclude that the utopian impulse in political thinking is simply the residue of a dangerous political theology that we're much better off without? Is the upshot of the critique of mystical anarchism that we should be resigned in the face of the world's violence and inequality and update a belief in original sin with a reassuringly miserabilistic Darwinism? Should we reconcile ourselves with the options of political realism, authoritarianism, and liberalism? Should we simply renounce the utopian impulse in our personal and political thinking? If so, then the consequence is clear. The consequence is that we stay with the way things are. Right? We stay with the situation. To abandon the utopian impulse in thinking is to imprison ourselves within the world as it is, and to give up once and for all the prospect that another world is possible, however small, however fleeting, and however compromised such a world might be. In the political circumstances that presently surround us in the West, to abandon the utopian impulse in political thinking is to resign oneself to the fact of liberal democracy, which is the rule, the reign of the law, which renders impotent anything that would break with the law. The miraculous, the moment of the event, the break with the situation in the name of the common. Let me return for a last time to mystical anarchism and to the question of self-deification. I mean, defending the idea of becoming God is maybe going a little far. I appreciate that. But, and to embrace such a mysticism would be to fall into what someone like Badiou calls the obscurantist discourse of glorification in his book on St. Paul. I could say more about that. You know, it's to base an idea of politics upon what Badiou calls a ravished subjectivity, the ravished subjectivity of the mystic, communing with the divine. He wants to oppose that to the experience of St. Paul, which he thinks is an ethical experience which is anti-obscurantist. Yet, so we accept, you know, Badiou is right and all of that. Yet to acquiesce in such a conclusion would be to miss something vital about mystical anarchism. What I want to call, in closing, its politics of love. What I find most compelling in someone like Marguerite Porete is the idea of love as an act of absolute spiritual daring. Absolute spiritual daring that eviscerates the old self in order that something new can come into being. In Anne Carson's words, love dares the self to leave itself behind, to enter into poverty and to engage with its own annihilation, to hack and hew away at oneself in order to make a space that's large enough for love to enter. What is being attempted by Porete, and perhaps it's only the attempt that matters here, not some theophanic outcome. What's being attempted is an act of absolute daring, not for some nihilistic end, but in order to open what we might call the immortal dimension of the subject. The immortal dimension of the subject. First time I've ever written that. The only proof of immortality is the act of love. The daring that attempts to extend beyond oneself by annihilating oneself. A project that projects onto something that exceeds one's powers of projections. What is love? To love is to give what one does not have and to receive that over which one has no power. Right? To give what one does not have and to receive that over which one has no power. As Landau would put it, the point is not to kill others, but to kill oneself in order that a transformed relationship to others becomes possible, some new way of conceiving community and being with others. Anarchism can only begin with an act of what Landau calls inward colonization, the act of love that demands a transformation of the self. Finally, very simply, such an anarchism is not a question for the future. What normally happens at the end of papers like this, it's a question of how one lives now. The issue, in many ways, is very simple. It's how does one behave, right? That's the issue. Is such a thing conceivable and practicable without moralism, purism, immediacy, the slide back into delusion, obscurantism, and maybe even a cult of violence that we saw with previous communistic experiments? I don't know. That's it. Thank you very much.
In a moment, I'll be responding to aspects of Simon Critchley's talk and also to the longer paper from which it's derived as a kind of buffer zone between the talk and your questions for Simon. But before more words, or as Sarah Palin would say, verbiage, I'd like to play a little song whose original you may well recognize, though this more recent cover version of it is, I think, not so well known. So could we have the audio clip, please? We should just stop here, but that was Anarchy in the UK, originally by the Sex Pistols, of course, but here reworked by the LA band Artichoke, whose name occurred to me could be broken down as Art, I Choke. So often when we use the word we don't really know who or what we are talking about. The we invoke is more often than not the product of a surmise or a hope, rather than some hard and fast knowledge, even if uttered with confidence or presumption. It's always a risky business, implying the usually unasked and not necessarily answered question, who are we? An even more fabulously difficult question than who am I, and a more pressing one. The title of our symposium already suggests we consider the we in a number of guises. We as subjects, ourselves, which is perhaps to say as objects of our own reflection, and us as objects, at least grammatical objects. We as we might be seen from the outside. And as such, it's surely a more promising phrase than me, or I, me, mine, or moi, which could easily be the title for a lot of symposia and the odd art exhibition, I would say. We might be skewing the question of the we by posing it as one of identity in the first place. Who are we? For the dynamics of group dynamics are such that identity is so much in flux, so much a function of its performance at this or that moment, so complex and variegated, even divided against itself, that the question of identity is not always the most pertinent, even if it's also unavoidable. If the question of the we is an open question, that is not quite to say that it is one to be deferred endlessly to some nebulous future. As June Jordan once wrote in a poem whose closing line was echoed by Alice Walker and has been echoed numerous times by a certain Barack H. Obama. I hope you noticed that in his introduction the other day. Barack H. Obama. We are the ones, this is June Jordan, we are the ones we are waiting for. Without saying it explicitly, this final line of Jordan's Poem to South African Women, that's the title, implies all three of our terms, we, ourselves, and us. We have to recognize ourselves, us, as the we. By contrast with the millenarian groups invoked in Simon Critchley's rich talk and even richer essay on which it's based, Jordan's line collapses the vast narrative arcs common to the millenarians, stories of messianic redemption or a second coming. Critchley's synthesizing critical history is partly one about the past concern with the future, of what then was to come, of communities preeminently concerned with what was to come, especially repressed or suppressed marginal groups, dislocated, who felt the pressure or desire to imagine a communal future at odds with the state of things. Jordan short-circuits the more familiar stories of a we waiting for a him, usually it's a him, in some apocalyptic future either far off or, as for St. Paul, just around the corner. Something of that urgency silently informs the title of the exhibition to which our symposium is attached and to which it responds, about which more in a moment. If we are the ones we are waiting for, this is not at all to say that we are our own messiahs, even if we might agree with Walter Benjamin that we are somehow responding to calls from the past, to demands on the present, facing a future that is nothing if not uncertain. In the light of this, we can be grateful to Simon Critchley for providing us with a bracing set of reflections that go back to some decidedly different moments of the past, the shock of the old, as it were, but not without fast-forwarding us into the present. Some of his chosen figures of the past, from medieval mystics such as Marguerite Porete, or Reformation rabble-rousers like Thomas Müntzer or John of Leyden, figures crucial to Cohen's study, The Pursuit of the Millennium, have some uncanny resonances for our current conjuncture and maybe something to teach us. At once theoretical and historical, Critchley's thinking shuttles between the distant past and what is more or less our present, one shot through with more shards of the past than we tend to acknowledge. At the outset of the long version of the essay of which you've heard a summary in excerpts, Critchley takes seriously the contention by Carl Schmitt, the theorist we love to hate and hate to love, and I quote, once again, you heard it once, "All significant concepts in the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts." The force of this notion can be more or less pertinent in given cases, but as a generalization, it helps illuminate a lot. The theological, Critchley helps to show us, casts a long shadow even where we don't see it, as his account of original sin makes plain. Even non-believers, he contends, are bound to labor under transformed, disguised, or muted versions of it. Secular enlightenment of the sort preached by the Enlightenment is easier said than done. I'm abridging a little bit here, but the community, including at the extreme, the absolute community, ones informed by metaphysics and/or religions with truth claims, this sort of community is very hard to talk about. The problem is defining the universal, that in defining the universal, we tend to say too much. The more we specify what that community entails, its values, what it believes, the more we in effect exclude any number of others. Take a charged example from St. Paul, who's not one figure among others. St. Paul, who has of late been almost rechristened as a philosopher in a flurry of theoretically oriented writings about him. He's often showcased for having said, and I quote, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female." And it's precisely from this passage from Galatians that is quoted the first time in Badiou's study of St. Paul, like that, which is remarkable for its omission of the complete sentence, which actually ends with the resounding phrase, I quote from St. Paul, "For all you are one in Jesus Christ." Doesn't this addendum make all the difference? Here, as elsewhere, the universal, the absolute totality is invoked in a mode that is less and other than universal. While I agree with and admire with a good many of Simon Critchley's remarks on the risks of abstraction, I'd also say there's a risk to the concrete, to being too concrete in defining a community, especially a community that pretends to the universal. The communities might well spend rather less time spelling out their content if communities are meant to be more inclusive than not. Of course, some are not meant to be so. This might apply even to small communities that often get bogged down in the narcissism of small differences. Early on in the longer paper, of which you've heard excerpts and a condensation, Critchley invokes a little phrase, not insisting on it, one that could have been omitted as it was not germane to the grammar, namely the little phrase, "for good or ill," in this sentence. I quote, "The question of community, of human beings together, has to be framed for good or ill in terms of this triangulation of politics, religion, and violence." Critchley might be referring primarily to the framing of the question of community rather than its content, but what interests me is the perhaps shocking character of the vast spectrum of possibilities in this triangulation from good to ill, both terms being not accidentally absolute. One of the virtues of Critchley's analysis is to show how much of thought about community and history lies in the shadow of a certain absolute, especially the idea of original sin. Not, of course, that we all remotely cling to this highly improbable and manifestly unfair notion in the first place, that original sin is passed on generation to generation. But such literal disbelief does not prevent the absolute from having a kind of hidden authority in shaping more transfigured versions of it. Maybe sometimes Critchley claims a little too much for this original sin. I think some Enlightenment recognitions of human limits, even if we call them imperfections, are not always conceived of as a falling off from some Edenic origin. Still, Critchley's point is well taken, and the power of this construct, too, is probably more pervasive than we tend to know anyhow. The phrase "for good or ill" can also make us aware of how too often we simply think of community as of itself a good thing. The word has almost only good connotations. Surely community sounds better than sheer individualism, isolated and atomized subjects, for starters. Yet the almost unthinking affirmation of community as a good thing flies in the face of the historical record, much of which is recalled in Critchley's talk via the triangulation of religion, violence, and politics, an odd but inescapable sort of trinity. We only have to conjure up something like Jonestown, much less Nazi Germany, and a host of not at all good communities will come flooding in. Good communities, of course, are good by definition. But what community, what we, does not tell itself that it is good? even if it's doing evil. It's virtually built into the idea and actuality of community, for good or ill, to tell itself that it is good, not ill. Hence the need for the we to try to be the ourselves and the us, to be a critical and self-critical community as one possible way to help make the community actually good, without quite guaranteeing it. The us is crucial, for it would behoove any community to attempt to look at itself as if it were an us, to see itself from the outside, lest we, or the we, just give in to a kind of group narcissism that tends to reflectively, that is to say, automatically affirm itself, for itself, and often against any and all others. This is too often the texture of nationalist ideology. Anarchism spends so much of its time resisting the state, but it might well have to contend as well with this sort of we rhetoric and more than rhetoric of the nation, which only sometimes overlaps with the state. The nation tells itself that it is good and more often than not great. Critchley's talk does not directly address the exhibition, except some nods at the end. He couldn't see it until a few hours ago. And we'll hear a lot more about the exhibition tomorrow. But it seems to me that his speculations and story are full of possibilities for thinking of it. Much as the title of our symposium, the title of the exhibition is just a phrase, a speculative phrase, not even a sentence, a phrase that implies some completion, but without importantly completing it. If there is a then pendant to this if, we are not told what it is. It seems to imply that it would be good if we got it together, whatever that is, and yet nothing is spelled out. One reason why art appears so appealing when thinking about community is that it tends to avoid the sheer moralism of which Critchley sees the danger in so many places, and more in the longer version than what you just heard. As the politically radical Shelley made clear in his defense of poetry, morally upbeat art eschews direct moralizing. It is in the realm of the oblique, of the metaphorical, the as if, that the power of poetry and art lie. Art founds, art institutes, art does things, but it does so on the whole obliquely. It is only in not trying to be good that art might be good, from Shelley's point of view. This partly explains why art is so often taken, as in Schiller and others, as a model for politics. We don't have to go as far as endorsing Schiller's fantastic notion of the aesthetic state to see the virtue of this. Have we come all that far from John of Leyden to Johnny Lydon? John of Leyden is actually in the text, although you can see now why I drew that out. Certainly when the Sex Pistols got together for their reunion tour in the 90s and called it the Filthy Lucre Tour, we're not so far from Luther. We may also have come a certain way from Johnny Lydon's or Johnny Rotten's Anarchy in the UK to Artichoke's cover version of it, from the intense rage of high punk to a sweet neo-beatnik poetics of love. John Lydon says, "Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it." Simon says, I tried to get through the whole talk without using that phrase, Simon says, but I failed at that. Simon says, "I know what I want, a politics of love, but I don't know exactly how to get it." I, and I dare say we, can hardly blame him, but we are extremely grateful for his thoughts towards this non-knowledge in this very free-spirited talk. Thank you.
Oh, is it? Okay, right.
So unless you have some thoughts on the Artichoke cover version, we'll go directly to questions from...
There is a mic that will come around.
Okay.
So if people could wait for the mic.
Yes, there is a mic coming around for questions.
I'll go. Y'all hear me back there?
Oh, okay. No, I just want to say first, man, that was very punk rock of you. You know what I mean? Religion, politics, and suicide. And I think, you know, some people say that punk rock is
not suicide, self-annihilation. It's not suicide.
self-annihilation. Okay. And some people say punk rock is dead, right? But maybe it killed itself, right? And maybe it's open for love now. I don't know. That's kind of what conjured up in my mind when you were talking. So, anyways, I look forward to your next album. So.
Well, the problem is between it's the cover version, it's the artichoke. It's like I have a real problem with these sort of soft, sort of loungy remixes because that's the strategy of reenactment again, right?
Yes.
The way in which we inhabit the past is through a reenactment where we can. It sounds like something that might have been radical at some point, and we can then, as it were, contain that. And what I worry about. What I most hate is irony, and that's true. I mean, I hate ironic, knowing distance. That's poison, and we live in deeply ironic times.
I might say they covered the whole album, the whole.
Yeah, no,
Sex
it's good.
Pistols
It's
album.
good. I mean,
Yeah.
I enjoy it, and the saxophone part was really good. But there's not that. It's just that that we're in a situation where we know always already what's going to happen. We're not surprised. We're insulated from anything which would surprise us. And everything can be explained as a reenactment of some previous radicalism, and it's contained, and we know better. And that's poisonous to the genuine possibility of some other state of affairs, it seems to me. But anyway, okay, right. So, yeah. But even punk was a reenactment. That's the thing about me. It wasn't as if the Sex Pistols were doing something. They were engaged in a reenactment of what McLaren thought he should be doing, right? And he managed to capture. He managed to sort of, grip a certain working class anger in people like John Lydon and the rest. But it was itself a reenactment. And it was a reenactment of the slogans of situationism without any critique of consumerism. That was the strategy that McLaren and Westwood.
Don't some reenactments sort of fall back into the past, and then some reenactments mark themselves in relation to the past, but as a kind of intervention? I mean, not all are simply ironic or.
No, but it's just sort of, I have a problem with the. A problem with the sort of use of reenactment, the way in which we need to think more about that, and the way in which the way in which, say, a political event becomes reenacted as an art event. I mean, what's going on? It's an invitation to reflect in all sorts of ways, but it's also a containment. It's also a containment of sorts, and that, if it's not that, then that's great. But that's my worry.
So
it's also obsessional. It's an obsessional containment, right? What the reenactor does is to obsessively, more perfectly than the original person did it, to get everything right, to get to recreate the Patty Hearst heist. So everybody's wearing the right clothes, and and it takes. You know what I mean? You
Yes,
get
maybe
the
the power plant goers will remember the Yves Sussman Velasquez reenactment, which, of course, very much attended to the perfection of its own reworking of that. But anyway, we have a question here in the front.
You started your talk by setting up two concepts of human nature, a right-wing authoritarian concept and a leftist utopian concept. And then that implies that somewhere, the impression I got from you was that in the middle was liberalism, which is kind of agnostic about human nature. Mm-hmm. And that interests me a lot because I would like to just present an idea that we've heard before, but maybe we've forgotten, which is that it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to say anything about human nature. Even the very concept of human nature is a ridiculous thing to begin with. Mm-hmm. Human nature is nothing other than the total of human behavior. That would be a very strong, I think, modern modern concept. And that being the case, you can't put any a priori limits on what human society could become. And if that is contemporary liberalism, and I think in the Obama version it's a kind of Habermasian idea that society is really just a conversation,
Yeah.
then it's actually
Democracy is not
kind of an
a house
interesting-
to be built, it's a conversation to be had.
Yeah,
It's a deliberative
exactly.
democracy. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is that I think the idea that there are no a priori limits on what society could be is a strong idea, and it's one I think that lies behind these relational art practices that we're talking
Oh,
about.
I see. Right. Okay. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. There's I mean, Habermas would be, probably is breakdancing somewhere in Germany as we speak, because it is deliberative democracy. It is, it's as anti-Schmittian as you can possibly imagine what Obama's trying to do, and it's also, I mean, what's millenarian in it, which is, is. And this is why I'm sympathetic to the figures like Carl Schmitt and John Graham, hugely sympathetic to these figures. I'm not dismissive. John Gray in particular, I think he's onto something deep. But the idea of progress, right? The way in which liberalism is attached to ideas of progress. Think about the inauguration speech the other day. There were those people who were on the wrong side of history, right? And those people who are not on the wrong side of history. History has a pattern. It's called progress. And this is a Saint-Simonian idea from the early 19th century, as we know, which poisons a certain conception of the world. So that there's like a weak millenarianism there with Obama, certainly at the rhetorical level, which is interesting. And also, I mean, what's interesting is the relationship to the divine there. I mean, Carl Schmitt says, I think it's a deep remark, that the political theology of liberalism is deism, right? The idea that we can identify nature and reason and God. So God is revealed. God is revealed in nature through the operation of reason. Let's say that. And what that does is to eliminate any order of the miraculous. Any order that there could be something miraculous that breaks with the state of affairs. I mean, that's exactly the liberal vision. Right? The liberal vision is one where the a priori is the rule of the Constitution, and there could be no exception to that Constitution. Anything miraculous that would break with it. So this is what's so interesting. For example, when Obama talks about God, as he does, it's a God who cannot act in the world, a God who has no power, a God that does not contradict rationality. In short, a God that isn't God, right? And so for me, it's the contradiction between that sort of rationalistic, sort of deistic liberal theology of, say, of Obama, with the radical prophetic Christianity of someone like Jeremiah Wright. That's the real sort of fault line for thinking about these things. And for me, the great silence of the last year has been that issue, the relationship between, if you like, radical prophetic Christianity, historically black Christianity, and this thing that we. I mean, what Obama's done brilliantly is to occupy the rhetorical space of Christianity as a way of infusing liberalism with something like belief, something like an experience of faith, without actually having any of the content of faith. It just sounds like it. That's brilliant, but it's a long way from that to Jeremiah Wright, and it's the latter that interests me.
Is there just one microphone? The Getty, with its big budget, has 2 microphones for these things. So that the next person.
So, Simon, I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the gendered aspects of mystical anarchism.
Absolutely. Any more to that? But I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. My boyhood passion was Meister Eckhart. I played him once when I was about 21 in a... Anyway. And I didn't realize that, I mean, Eckhart not only knew of Porret, but had access to Porret's heretical works because he stayed in the same house. The year after she was burnt at the stake, he stayed in the same house as her inquisitor in Paris. So he was immersed in this. So what you see in Eckhart, and this is the way I'm answering the question, is, if you like, the attempt to sort of deal with this female mystical experience and to contain it at the same moment. And there's almost a distinction between experiences as a male mysticism, which are usually, it's an experience of contemplative union, a contemplative intellectual union with the divine. Transitory, but there. The contrast between that and what you find in figures like Marguerite Porret, Thérèse Ravelot, and all the rest, which is this visceral, physical experience of union with the divine, which then all turns back to the question of the body. I mean, I tried to emphasize that in passing, but in Angela Foligno and these figures, it's about the I've got this great quote. Let me see if I can find it. It's just a great chance to read it out. Oh, Angela Foligno, where is it? Oh yeah, I've got it. Great. There are times when such anger ensues I'm scarcely able to stop myself from totally tearing myself apart. There are also times when I can't hold myself back from striking myself in a horrible way, and sometimes my head and limbs are swollen. Right? So, or Thérèse Ravelot talking about the pain was so great it made me moan. So the hacking and hewing away at the self as that which opens a space where love can enter is a sort of, the link between mystical experience and masochism really interests me. And that's something I'm just thinking about. And that's a difference between, to talk in general terms, female mystical experience and male mystical experience. And for me, it's the relation to the body there which is fascinating. Also, as I said, sociologically, we have maybe not the first occurrence, maybe the first occurrence in Northern Europe of women, daughters of the bourgeoisie, who were educated daughters of the bourgeoisie who had time on their hands, and who then decided to pledge themselves to the sort of begging life of mendicancy and voluntary poverty. I mean, Margaret Porret was burnt at the stake, and you think, well, that was quite a nasty way to go, but they really didn't want to burn her because she had powerful allies in the local aristocracy. So that scene in the Life of Brian where they're being taken off to be crucified, and there's a guy hanging upside down, crucified. He's so lucky to be crucified. Anyway, so she got away with. Anyway, so there is the gender dimension of this. I think is all through it, and for me, that's why the question of love becomes the key question. And as you might have heard when I referred to her a couple of times, but I think Anne Carson is absolutely onto something when she's talking about that experience of love as that experience of impoverishment, annihilation, submission.
The second last row, there's a question.
Because philosophers can't deal with the problem of love. That's the issue, right? The philosophical question is how to live. And that means the relationship to death, mortality. And, and I could talk for hours about that. Book of Dead Philosophers is all about that. But what about the question of love? And how does that transform the question of the self? That's for me the issue. Sorry.
Hi. I also just recently read this Amy Hollywood book. I find it fascinating.
You read the what, sorry?
Amy Hollywood.
Oh, right. It's great, yeah. She's great.
Yeah, it's really good. But something you said earlier made me think of this Leo Bersani book called The Freudian Body, where he talks about this, what you say is this sort of disjunction between eros and civilization. Mm-hmm. But Bersani has this, it's called The Freudian Body, Art and Psychoanalysis, but he has this text about how Freud sort of attacks himself in his own writing through his footnotes. And so it's really incredible argument, but then he goes on to have this whole sort of notion of the self-shattering of sexuality.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what happens if this argument sort of leaks into your paper. We certainly see this shattering in what's her name, Marguerite Porete. It's maybe, I wonder if we could talk about the difference between this self-shattering of sexuality and how this is sort of structural or maybe against structure in the notion of the self. So, sorry, I sort of got off track. But so this relationship between this self-shattering and this sort of self-annihilation, what's the difference there, if it's an authority of God or what?
The way I want to read, because if you look at the literature on this heresy of the free spirit, and then some of the people like Van Eyck that celebrate it, it's all about sexual liberation. You know, they see that the heresy is, the movement of the free spirit is about sexual liberation, if you want, then female sexual liberation in the medieval period. I think it's very limited. I think it's about a discipline of the self, which requires a transformation and renunciation of sexuality. I mean, what Freud would call sublimation. That's really what's interesting. So when I was talking about chastity, I was being sort of semi-serious about that. I mean, again, what we find maybe, what I find difficult about, say, 60s communal experiments was the emphasis upon sexual freedom, which has led to a sort of, I don't know, a certain tyranny of sexuality, where in a sense the most radical position to adopt would be that of chastity in a peculiar way. You know, at least it's something to think about. You know, we live in a sort of, you know, the culture industry has become the sex industry, right? And in a sense, anyway, so I see Porete as it's a way of transforming sexual experience in new ways. This isn't a response to your question, but here's a thought. I mean, Freud's idea is that there is a disjunction between eros and civilization, let's say. And that comes up in numerous texts, but it comes up most powerfully in his discussions of male sexuality. Male sexuality is, for Freud, is on the one hand, that there is this, men, this is the essays on the psychology of love, the tendency towards debasement in the sphere of love. This essay by Freud is fantastic. He says that men can only experience sexual desire in relation to a debased object, a debased, say, female object, the whore. Right? Love is experienced in relationship to the non-debased object, the wife. And as it were, the fundamental contradiction in male sexuality is that contrast between the whore and the wife, between the debased object of desire, which is only desired insofar as it's debased, and the relationship and the love object, which induces impotence in men. And the phenomenon that Freud is trying to think about in those essays is the phenomenon of psychical impotence, which I think is something we can think a lot about. It's a hugely interesting topic. The issue of so male sexuality. So Freud redescribes original sin, I think, as this disjunction between eros and civilization, as where the erotic drives have this sort of autonomy which always threatens to undermine whatever civilization might mean. That's male sexuality. What's female sexuality? Big question mark. And of course, that's the Freudian problem. What is? And I think Porete. I mean, that's you know, and there are various moments in Freud's work where he tries to confront that, but. I think that's what Porete is trying to articulate, and it would be, and what would it be? It would be, I mean, I shouldn't say this in public. I mean, it's, you know, but what does one want? I mean, one wants to love and desire in the same place, right? Can you love and desire in the same place? Freud says man can't. Love in one place, desire in another place. And in a sense, what Porete is dramatizing is the attempt to love and desire in the same place. That annihilation of the soul in the act of love, which is still the wanting of desire. That's what she's trying to articulate. And for me, I just sort of follow that and try and make sense of it. but that's a bad answer. There's a question there.
Is this-
It's difficult to see up here, isn't it?
Yeah.
with the lights?
It's right here.
Hi.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. And I was interested in, when you were mentioning a little bit about the history of mysticism and all these ideas that are coming back and forth between Christianity and secular society and so on. I was thinking about early 19th century America.
Yeah.
And early 1830s and 40s, where there was a huge movement, what we could say of mystical Christianity, the Millerite movement that gave birth to some of the more radical fundamentalist Christianity in USA and the world today. And a lot of rhetoric that they use or language that they use could be could be construed as very close to what you were, pulling out of the medieval mystics. So I was wondering, and there's a lot of in those texts, there's a lot of talk about love and the kind of removal of the self and so on. But in a way, it becomes extremely violent, and love is seen as a tool almost for violent action.
Yeah.
And the kind of and oppression. So how then do we play this very fine line between love being turned into a tool of violence and having a community in which it is truly realized and oneself is not seen as any other than the other? Right? That oneself is the same as the other.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer. But what you say is very interesting. If we think about Upper New York State in the early 19th century, in relationship to what I was talking about, it makes perfect sense. You have people who are not just poor, but a situation of radical dislocation. And that radical dislocation is a breeding ground for forms of millenarian religious belief. But also communism. There's a great book by someone called Nordhoff called The Communistic Societies of America, written in, I think, the late 19th century, which documents the various experiments from the Shakers through to the Owenites, New Harmony, and whatever. And, the United States was the homeland of communism, in that sense, communist experiments, which were always tied to forms of religious belief. And so the question that I don't think, can we pose the question of community without posing the question of religion? No, right? The two things are historically deeply entangled. And and not just that, what I tried to show in the paper, a talk, is that it really comes down to a question of how we see original sin, right? Community is something that can be free community is something that can be only had once original sin has been lifted, right? If original sin is still in place, then we require, if not the authority of the church, the authority of the state to police us, right? So at the core of any thinking of community is some sort of overcoming of a state of original sin. Now, the question of violence is all over this, and you're right to raise it. And if you read Cohn, what he's trying to show, and people like John Gray are trying to show, is the way in which the history of communism, if you like, is a history of violence. Right? It's the attempt to bring about the rule of virtue through terror, right? Jacobinism, and there's a lot to be said for that. But I'm just trying to think more generally about that, because the conclusion of those positions is to accept liberalism or accept forms of political realism. I don't want to do that. So this is why I was very attracted to this idea in Landau about it's not a question of killing others, but killing oneself. Right? This idea, we could think about at some level the condition of possibility for something like community is a transformation at the level of the self. Right? What Badiou would call becoming a subject or whatever. And without that, so I'm trying to at least get around the question of violence by thinking about self-violence.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that there's actually, it's very interesting, when I was listening to you about Marguerite Perot, the woman who actually led one of the post-Millerite movements was a mystic.
Yeah.
And she had these amazing visions and wrote on it. And it's very interesting because one of the main things that she writes is the kind of annihilation of the self.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. So anyways, thank you.
Yeah, I talk about the Shakers in passing, but Anne Lee, working class woman from Manchester, who has a series of visions, goes to the New World, and declares herself the female complement to Christ, right? Makes perfect logical sense. We have two gods, a male and female principle. And based upon, so we have there a radical sexual egalitarianism, property owned in common, and religious celebration becomes the celebration of the spirit in the community. That's what they do in that weird shaker dancing they used to do. Yeah. So is there a need for something? No, let me put it another way. When we're thinking about the issue of community, let me put it in a way that I'm satisfied with. Mysticism becomes an essential ingredient for a rethinking of community, right? In a way that doesn't want to fall into the sort of anomie and anemia of liberalism on the one hand, or whatever. This is why another figure that I've been dipping my toes back into again after years and years of not reading him is Georges Bataille. I mean, this is where Norsey is getting it from, right? I mean, Bataille's concerned with mystical experience, a mystical experience as the central experience that would be at the core of the articulation of community. And Bataille's obsession throughout his career was with the possibility of forms of anti-fascist community, right? The Acéphale, headless community, and so on and so forth. And anyway.
We were meant to wrap up at 9.
Go
Maybe
for
we
a
could
bit
have
of-
one more question.
Sorry.
I've got the mic.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And you're not giving it up.
I'm not giving it up. I'm just
So
quickly.
maybe 2 if they're brief.
All right, all
Okay.
right. And there's another one just ahead of me who wants it too. I just wondered whether
We can't see you up here. It's the problem. It's really, the
I'm
lights
here.
are really bright.
Yeah.
Hi.
I wondered whether you had ever considered the parallels between mystical anarchy and Buddhism, the notion of the egolessness, the lack of duality, the notion of the divine being within. There just seems to me to be some very strong parallels that happened many centuries, that were articulated very clearly a long
Yeah.
time before.
Yeah, it's an open question for me. I mean, I don't know. I just don't know the answers to that. I mean, I have my suspicions, but why not? Yeah.
That was quick. One more.
No, but it's true. It's my ignorance at that point.
This person there was insistent. So.
I was waiting, actually, to hear if you were going to bring up Bataille. I was waiting the whole lecture for that.
Okay. There's a couple of lines in the lecture on Bataille, but yeah.
Well, the truth is, I wanted to say that, I applaud your courage in a lot of ways. In many ways, I was lost and confused at times.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was entirely the fault of yours, or that you're developing your ideas, and so there's still a vagueness attached to some of the terms and the concepts, or whether it has to do in part with the forum. I have to say, honestly, I'm put off by how much introducing there goes on beforehand, and it actually makes it much more difficult for me. Okay, I'll just set that aside. One particular thing that I wanted to note was you used the term self-deification.
Yep.
Bataille would take entire issue with that notion. He speaks in mysticism of a suppression of the subject and a suppression of the object, that it has to be both. And my sense is that part of the confusion is attached to the term community. You were speaking of it in political, though what it was lacking was, to use Bataille as an example, he uses the term communication, yeah? So that there's a denial, it's not quite a denial actually, it's a denuding of self in communication that opens up and liberates the possibility of the moment. That's the community that he had in mind. So he often cites, for instance, André Breton, the statement that Breton makes that the most surrealist act is to run out them. Yeah? And that there's something paradoxical about that. Well, Breton is not promoting murder of others. What he is the moment of chance that is so lacking in our day-to-day, everyday lives, which, and just to bring it back, which I find is in part actually glaringly missing in today.
Oh, chance. Well, you want to shoot people or something?
No, I don't want to shoot people
We
at
could
all.
reenact